Shalom from Jerusalem, Powers in Play, a look at the world as a chess game or another board game. And with us for the next episode of Powers in Play are Colonel in the Reserves, Miri Eisin. Hello, Miri. Another retired reserve colonel, retired but sometimes on active reserve, Eran Lerman, Dr. Eran Lerman, welcome.
First Sergeant.
Our diplomat in residence, Ambassador Alon Pinkas, former Consul General in New York and a senior official at the Foreign Ministry, and retired Colonel Reuven Ben-Shalom. Welcome to all of you. Is the Cold War coming back? The question is posed because we are now marking 30 years to the end of the original Cold War, which ended in late December 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the emergence of Russia as the leader of what was then called the Commonwealth, and then separate republics, some of whom resemble in their regimes the old Soviet era. And because we are now faced with crisis between Russia and the Ukraine, China and Taiwan, and other hot points around the world, the question is now being summed as, are we going to start, are we facing a new second Cold War? Eran Lerman, please.
Well, the Cold War had three characteristics. It was the world became bipolar. You were either with the Soviets or with the Americans. It became unsustainable, as our Egyptian neighbors found out, to actually try to successfully maneuver in between.
You don't believe that the term non-aligned was really that?
Most of the non-aligned ended up being aligned with one bloc or the other, or found themselves at the receiving end of nudges from both. The second element was the nuclear competition. Not ever escalating. In the 1970s, it came under some control, but the fact that both blocs, both superpowers held the capacity to destroy not just each other, but the entire world several times over. One wonders how you do it the second time, but they had 6 or 7 overkills by some estimates.
You get better at it as you go along.
And the third was the ideological divide. The Soviet Union stood for a very different social order, a very different set of economic precepts. The situation now is more complicated because, the People's Republic of China, which is the rising leader, Russia, with all due respect, has 4% of the aggregate GDP of the NATO alliance. You don't compete for world leadership as an economy the size of South Korea or smaller than Italy. But China is a very different proposition. But China is a hybrid case in 2 respects. It is a communist party in control of a semi-capitalist economy. And unlike the Soviet Union, and for the immediate and intermediate future, it is dependent on export markets and in a very intensive interrelationship with the international global economic system. So for the Chinese to bring it down by an act of brutalizing Taiwan, which would be very costly, very bloody. I've just read a piece by a former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who's actually a
China scholar.
China scholar, reads Mandarin and is current with what Xi is doing. And he warns the Chinese that this may look like a small morsel, but it will be a very painful one to try and bite. But the general result internationally, the collapse of Chinese ability to go to international markets, all of this would have catastrophic consequences for the Chinese government. So this is different from the Cold War era.
Alon, you just came back from the United States where you had conversations with key officials in Congress and elsewhere. Is this the view in Washington? And if it is, does the Biden administration find common cause with its European allies and others, or the Japanese?
Well, with the Japanese, obviously, yes, because the big challenge and threat is perceived to be China. And there's no question that there is a dramatic and consistent shift of U.S. resources, intellectual expenditure of thinking, and a movement of resources to the Chinese.
Henry Kissinger was perhaps the first one to identify many years ago.
He did, but he did it in the context of encircling the Soviet Union rather than.
No, even later as
he did.
a civilian.
He most certainly did.
He writes very few thin books, and
Right.
the one about China wasn't one of them.
That's true. And you do see a definition of China as the next great evil empire. However, as Eran correctly pointed out, unlike the Soviet Union, the Chinese economy is dependent on the U.S. and vice versa. There is an interconnectedness that cannot be undone. With that in mind, you asked, your initial question, Amir, was about the Cold War. We have a human tendency to define things that we can't yet define accurately in terms of things we can define because they were in the past, and then draw conclusions. This is not a Cold War in the Soviet American sense. And the question is it going to be a 1980s, let's bash Japan because they're taking over America, which never materialized? Or is it a serious thing in which the U.S. may find itself, and you may have read Admiral Stavridis' book, novel 2034, about a miscalculation that begins in the South China Sea, expands to Taiwan, and before you know it, there's a mini war going on, and ergo, it is no longer a Cold War. It's definitely the defining issue for America right now. Not the Middle East, not Ukraine, which seems to be nothing more than a nuisance for them, not the Iran nuclear deal. They couldn't care less about that. It's all about China.
Well, Miri, Eisin, the Cold War, the term Cold War, was in itself a sort of a takeoff on the World War II, which then beget World War I, because earlier it was only the Great War. And you are an experienced intelligence officer by trade. Can intelligence professionals predict what is going to happen shortly? Of course, they can predict the long run because
And
no one will be there to judge them. But in the shorter run, 2, 3, 5 years, can intelligence, with all of the marvelous devices that the human mind has come up with, can it predict the trends, at least, if not the actions themselves? And if they do, can strategic planners make out of it some outline and change and influence the shape of things to come?
So look at what Amir just did. He separated the strategic decision makers from the intelligence community. And here I want to combine them back in, because there's no question that the intelligence community anywhere is going to try to predict, to build scenarios, because everybody needs to make plans and we don't know what's going to happen. Having said that, in today's world, maybe we need to coin a new term. Don't like the Cold War either. It's not a world war. But there is a global struggle going on in its own way. It's like the globalization struggle, where it isn't necessarily, it's rapidly changing alliances that are based a bit more, both economically, realpolitik. What does the intelligence do? The intelligence is going to build a scenario but every intelligence builds the scenario for its own national country. I don't build it for the United States. I don't have the same interests in Israel. I'm looking from my point of view to the world. The United States is a world power. They're looking at it differently.
But there are derivatives. You
The
have,
derivatives-
as an intelligence officer, you have to bear that in mind.
I agree, but I disagree, because I've sat inside the Israeli intelligence community, and the people inside the intelligence community that are looking at the world are not the main essence of the Israeli intelligence community. You're going to look first at the threats that you really feel, and at the term itself in that sense, threats and opportunities. And that aspect of looking globally at the different powers in play is always going to be relative to where you sit within that. So I do think that we'll build scenarios. And I think one of the biggest questions right now on our table is that huge issue of Israel has an economic strong relationship with China and with Europe, and then you get the United States.
It's dwindling.
And as you see that going in and about, that's part of the question. Where are our choices? Do we actually think we're going to choose strategically anybody over the United States?
Let me ask Reuven that question, because you are very familiar with both the Chinese and the Americans. And when Israel has to come up with some construct, the Americans are now officially calling China our pacing rival. That means that when they build their defense establishment, they look at China as the bigger threat, the bigger challenge around which they write their contingency plans. And if there are smaller wars, they will try to adapt to them. Now, China is not a military threat to Israel, but Israel can be crushed between the two giants.
I think it's a very interesting point, because we sort of put ideology aside, as if in this day and age we just talk about interest, resources, but I think ideology is always there. It's almost like a lot of the clashes that we see have to do with peoples that have this sense that they've been let down or not respected enough. I think that's a very important part of the Chinese narrative these days, right? We've been humiliated for 100 years. It's our turn now. It's interesting, by the way, in a way, this small country, Israel, also has some of these characteristics, right? We believe we have this important place in the world, etc. Of course, no global aspirations.
You see it on the China side, too, in the way sometimes they look at Israel and Israel's narrative.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
fascinating.
But what's
the
interesting?
Jewish people, you die.
So I think these issues.
old peoples.
I think these issues, of
Love
course,
of old peoples.
of psychology almost are critical to understand. Also, look at the fact that the Americans have ingrained in them this idea they want to export democracy, export the ideas. Chinese don't want to export anything, right? They just want their place in the world. They are the center of the world for them. They don't want to change anybody else or even conquer, by the way, but they certainly want to be a world, a power, okay? I see for decades my American counterparts using rhetoric that is much more than what you just said, more than rivals. They talk about threats, enemies. Pilots are preparing for dogfights with Chinese pilots. I think a lot of this is an exaggeration because
It already happened in Korea.
and it could happen again, by the way, in South China Sea, easily. Look what's happening. Well, there's going to be a miscalculation. But I'm just saying that the Chinese, at least overtly, are almost insulted. How can they think that about us? All we want is a place in the world, right? So, of course, the Chinese know to play the game masterfully. They have their aspirations, their ambitions, and they're doing it in a calculated way. Another thing that we Israelis don't really understand. They have a very structured philosophy. They even write it down. Right, in the Communist Party convention, they talk about what the next plan is going to be. It's certainly not dogfights with American pilots, but it's an honorable place in the world and to be a world leader.
And when you read statements by the key officials of the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, including, for instance, Admiral Christopher Grady, who has been nominated as the next vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you see a lot of concern regarding the Chinese incursion right now, commercially, diplomatically, first to Africa and then to Latin America. Are these going to be the new arenas in which the powers in play will contend with each other?
Well, the BRI definitely is
Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative, Yida Yilu, to the best of my limited Chinese, is certainly a cause for concern for the Americans because it builds leverage. It builds leverage in the Gulf, We saw a small power play over what seemed to be a covert military hold in the Emirates by the Chinese, which the Americans...
Just an innocuous port.
Yeah, well, there was something in that port that apparently led the Americans to push back. And so that's definitely part of the story. Latin America, of course, is susceptible to economic pressures. Some years ago, there was a notion of the BRICS. The BRICS was supposed to, which was an elegant contraption, but in terms of its initials, but it actually pulled together very disparate nations, certainly disparate now under the current Jair Bolsonaro is certainly not one with China or with Russia.
Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Russia, India, China,
I think
and they
that
added
China found that as being, continuing to what Reuven said before, in its own way insulting to be put in that same group. So there's very different ways of looking at that, because I think it had an impact then. Who are they to put us in that group?
It was, I think, a way of the Russians, I think, tried to push for it, and South Africa was thrown in, basically saying this is the club of nations which would lead their regional areas and would oppose American hegemony. This was the essence of it. Of course, nothing came out. They still meet from time to time, but it's an empty box. But still, the Chinese would definitely push, particularly for the Pacific Ocean. Coastal nations of Latin America.
I'm going to step in here for a moment and just add in that sense that Iran kind of just mentioned, the big, in that sense, highway that's being built from China towards both Europe, towards Africa. For a moment, I want us to go down a level. We talk about the powers in play. We didn't mention Africa as usual. And just to think about what it means for people. Somebody is building a road. That road is going to have a real big impact. We're so used to talking about the sea lanes, about the air lanes. China is building road lanes. These are things that are supposed to impact people on the ground.
But Miri, in the 1950s,
the United States built interstate highways and changed the United States.
No,
but at the same time.
But in the 19
Of course not, but yes.
During the Cold War, when Afghanistan, for instance, was in play, the Americans and the Soviets built roads there, traversing the country. One power built it north to south, the other east to west, and never the twain shall meet. So people had to obey the strategic imperatives of their patrons.
But I don't underestimate that aspect of things that are being built. It's 2021 now. It's not the 1950s. It's not the Cold War. And when a country like China invests in practical aspects that impact people in creating jobs, well, maybe not. They send a lot of Chinese to do so.
Right.
But in that sense, here in Israel, under our own radar, we have a Chinese port. We have different things that are going to benefit Israel.
It's not under the American radar.
Let me bring in another term, NATO.
You're right.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Atlantic apparently has been now at least relegated to second status. It is not as important for the Americans as the Pacific. The Pacific could mean, of course, Latin America, but mostly what separates or connects the United States from China. And China in the South China Sea threatens the Philippines and perhaps other countries in the region. Of course, there is the problem of Taiwan, Singapore, and many other problems. So what role does NATO still have to play when the attention of the world shifts eastward?
I don't know, and the thing is, I don't know that NATO knows. And
searching.
I think they're happy with being relegated to lesser importance. Two generations at least of Europeans were brought up under an imminent Soviet armored threat from the east. That's not the case anymore. That doesn't mean that the Baltics are not feeling a certain threat, or Ukraine for that matter. NATO became more of a political alliance that was weakened as America shifted its emphasis to the Far East or to the Pacific Rim. NATO may move down south, and NATO may be used at some point to counter Chinese initiatives with not military. I'm talking about
Alon, I
economic.
want to ask you a question. How can NATO have any relevance when Turkey is a strong member? I look at that and I go,
No,
what in the world
okay,
is this?
okay.
No, it's not Turkey. It's the problem of consensus that each decision must be agreed to by all 30.
Let me try and answer that. Although we're downsizing the conversation.
But
to
it's
Turkey.
about NATO.
Here's the thing: there are two major mistakes, strategic mistakes in retrospect, that NATO made. The first one was not to pressure the EU, while it was established, to include Turkey in it. There were many promises made to Turkey to be integrated into the European Union that could have saved us this Erdogan phenomenon.
But I'm talking about the relevance of Turkey in NATO.
Number two, there was a decade that began with the fall of the disintegration of the Soviet Union and ended roughly with 9/11. That was a decade of China not yet emerging as a global world power, and the U.S. enjoying almost exclusive dominance and hegemonic powers all over the place. At that time, NATO was so high on its own Kool-Aid that they started expanding. And when the Russians said, do not do this, Russia was weak. And now you have Ukraine, and now you have a member of NATO called Turkey, which acquires S-400 anti-aircraft missiles designed against NATO-developed airplanes like the F-35.
Is that not showing, though, in that sense that idea of NATO being anything today?
Well, hold on for a second. Reuven never butts in, but courtesy will get you nowhere.
So I'll tell you what I think about NATO, but I can't address the Turkey issue, too complex. But I think Israelis have a tendency to underestimate alliances and organizations. And many times, by the way, when they're gone, we Israelis say, where are they? We need them. I think that NATO is critical. And I think, of course, the foundations are different from after the Second World War. And the whole question of Chapter 5 of protecting each other even has to change because it's less of a kinetic strike of a military, right? What about cyber attacks? Do they have to defend each other now when they're attacked through cyber? But I think now the United States, there are things that it can't do alone, but it can do under the umbrella of NATO. And European countries can't promote many of their goals only through NATO. So I think also when we look at NATO, they're not confined geographically. They're working in the Horn of Africa and in Asia. I think the next decade we'll see a strong NATO, and I think it's critical for them. I think they will use that as a tool. As to the main question here about Cold War, I think I oppose most of you because I think this is a classic Cold War, although, of course, it has some different characteristics. The fact that they're intertwined, and you mentioned that, that's a major difference. Because when you're intertwined economically, of course, you can't call them.
No, by the way, none of us said it's not a Cold War.
No,
we
the
just said
terminology.
the term.
It's
may-
not the Cold War we knew.
exactly.
But you know,
You could argue
Reuven,
terminology.
the United States cooperates with Russia, among others, on Iran regarding the JCPOA. But at the same time, there are sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia. So how can one live with this contradiction?
During the Cold War, they went to space together. You can still see in the Space
Apple
Museum
sauce.
in
End of the
Moscow.
Cold War.
No, but that is
Which was called applesauce.
Yes.
Apollo Soyuz.
no, but that is a big difference. We're not talking about entities that are out to destroy each other, that actually sitting waiting for the bombs to fall. That's not it anymore. But the world is at war. It's just that in this day and age, everyone understands that going to war with an army, you lose points.
So if we
But let me come in on NATO because we tend to forget that by now the EU has been reduced to continental Europe, whereas the NATO still includes, in addition to Canada, which is not a trivial player geopolitically, and Norway, which has perhaps some relevance for the northern regions, it includes the United Kingdom, which is in its own way still a formidable strategic
Still
player.
united?
It's still kept together somehow.
Of the three words, formidable United Kingdom, only the kingdom stands.
Well,
sorry to the UK viewers.
Militarily, I wouldn't put them down. They are this new business called the AUKUS
AUKUS.
is an indication that here's a NATO player coming into the Indo-Pacific.
Australia, UK, US.
Australia, UK, US, with a tripartite project on nuclear submarines. And there's a 5-letter word that we haven't mentioned yet, and that's India, which will soon surpass China in terms of population, which has ambitions of its own. And if there is a page taken from the Cold War playbook, it's the concept of containment.
And that's where the Quad comes in.
And that's where the
The
Quad,
Quad is more important than AUKUS.
the Quad and AUKUS, and now the Indian idea of a Western Quad, as they call it, or a small Quad, with Israel considered a significant enough strategic player to be counted.
There's something called, and you intelligence officers were not aware of it when you were actually...
Five Eyes.
No, yeah. The Five Eyes was always there.
Yeah.
No. I mean, from an
We were the
intelligence point of view.
sixth.
No. There's a term that no one can define geographically or politically as Indo-Pacific. No
Yes.
one knows what the hell Indo-Pacific means. How can you call something Indo-Pacific? You know how big that is? But it nonetheless exists in the Pentagon and in the State Department. And
Yes.
the Quad is based on Japan and India.
The interim guidance.
Of course.
Again
Now,
and
now
again on
let
the
me
Indo-Pacific.
expand on the term containment, which Iran brought in. What Russia is doing now vis-a-vis the Ukraine and other moves that Putin is obviously setting in place looks like containment. No one talks about rollback. No one is trying to take back the clock to 2013 before the Crimea adventure. And what Putin cleverly does is make the other powers ask him, please, go back from the border of eastern Ukraine, take your divisions back, just don't invade. They will all heave a sigh of relief if he does that, and that will be enough for them. Isn't that the case?
But I would say at the end of the day, for these small gains, for this bite of the Donbass and even Crimea, Russia has actually sacrificed a much greater gain that could have been there. Back in 91, I think it was Jim Baker who spoke about Vancouver to Vladivostok. He envisioned a world in which Russia would be a legitimate, prosperous, integral part of the West. True, the Japanese did nothing to help, mind you, with all that's my grievance with Friedman's book about the olive trees and the cars, because the Japanese would not give the Lexus car, and they wouldn't give a yen to Russia as long as Russia is holding on to 4 barren pieces of land which they think is theirs. So territorial grievances are not unique to the Middle East. Having said all this, Russia could have become part of the West. If it is not careful, in the next few decades, it will become irretrievably a Chinese satrapy. And that would be a tragic outcome.
But isn't this because we all want to see little Americas everywhere?
No.
The Russians don't
Here
want...
I am sitting and listening to us, and I'm going to say in my own terms, are patronizing Western. The Russians need to be like us. The Chinese need to be like us. And I'm sitting here and saying, you know, there are actually other options that scare us all completely.
We were asked to be in this studio to be patronizing. So
But I, for a moment,
Or
says the only woman
Matronizing
here,
it
right?
should be
Okay, but I'm not worried about it. I want to point it out for a moment that as we sit here right now, from the different positions that we've presented, we find it very difficult to look at it not from that Western, very patronizing view in that sense, because maybe China doesn't want to conquer the world and China wants a space, and that really scares me. And when we talk again in that sense of India or Russia and the different players, and then we come back and say, but they need to be like us. And I'm like, who says who? There's all sorts of different ways to go about. I wonder, okay, I worry, but you say India is going to pass China with the amount of people about demography. And again, I'm going to be a Reuven right now and say, The most people are in Africa, and we haven't mentioned them. And when we look at the powers in play, it's not just about China being in Africa, United States being in Africa. It's about how Africa is going to be Africa. And we don't look at that at all. What happens if they take a place?
But Reuven, what Miri brings up is not just an ideological question or philosophical one to be debated at Oxford, Harvard, or Stanford, which is where the Bush administration's major lights like Condoleezza Rice came from. It was the motor behind military moves. Iraq was to be made a democracy in spite of itself. The Palestinian community and many other places, even if we put aside interests, even let's say out of innocence, out of some idealistic approach, in some cases because of the experience of key officials who came up in the Black South and wanted to bring the same experience and same influence that the United States has.
Or Jews who fought for Soviet Jewry in the 70s and became enemies of Kissinger's realism.
Indeed. So, Reuven, please.
But this is something that it's National Security 101, understanding the small part that military plays, right? Just a small component of using military might and understanding this Cold War, or whatever you want to call it now, as a broad struggle for dominance, for resources, for recognition and all that. And the military is playing a smaller and smaller piece in this because it's not worth it. So countries like Russia and China, and we are talking about powers. We're talking about powers, so really I will less mention India because they don't have these aspirations that are perceived as threatening to the West right now. But certainly Russia and China challenge the US, they challenge the current world order. And to achieve this, they do it in tools that are under the threshold that will irritate or bring about military escalation. And they're doing, some of these things are significant, like Crimea and South China Sea, what China is doing there. It's almost aggressive, but always carefully under this threshold. So again, I will see the military is always there. The United States will always project power with their aircraft carriers, but all of them do not want to see the military confrontation.
Yeah,
Yes,
there
Eran,
are two technological developments which I think are changing the nature of the game. One is supersonic missiles, which basically undermine the structure of defense or ABM systems.
Anti-ballistic missiles.
Anti-ballistic missiles from the 70s and the later generation that was built under the Reagan Star Wars SDI initiative. And the second thing is the capacity to destroy satellites in space, which could bring all of us. Try to imagine the world we live in without internet, without connectivity, without...
Was there ever a time when we made do?
We ever lived without it?
Yeah, 10 years ago.
No, but certainly...
And yet again, you went back to the military. And I think that we, again, I'm agreeing here that we need to look at additional dimensions, that it's national security is not just that military dimension, and that when we go there, I think that we're doing discounts to ourselves. And
Reuven and then Alon.
The more we explore technology and the threats emerging, the more we understand why those are tools that nobody wants to use. It's just lose-lose for everyone. So they're going to try to move away from that as much as possible, doing things that are aggressive. And by the way, also small Israel, does aggressive actions throughout the Middle East, all the way to Iran. And there's always this question of assuming responsibility, yes or no. And we understand the great advantage of not assuming responsibility, even though it's becoming popular now in Israel to say that.
Alon.
Okay, just one. No,
yes, go ahead, sir.
Just one. We keep on talking about the Cold War and superpower and powers in play. Okay, the U.S. still retains enormous technological, scientific, military, and economic power, unprecedented. The U.S. economy is $22 trillion compared to the 15 or 15.5 trillion of China's economy. But at the same time, U.S. democracy is precarious, it is tenuous, it is backsliding. The U.S.'s ability to project power outside emanates from the U.S.'s strength inside, domestically, and the U.S. has been severely weakened in the last 4 years. What you saw on the 6th of January was not a bunch of pro-Trump tourists trying to get souvenirs from the Capitol. It was very close, according to the reports emerging from the committee.
So it's a good sign. It's convergence between the systems of government,
because we
of
in
the
Israel,
autocracies.
right? But we in Israel tend to still think of America in terms of an omnipotent world power that could do whatever it pleases.
And the shining city on the hill.
And a shining city on the hill, which is, by the way, was never said. Reagan invented that term, and it's just not that way anymore. And if you look at how the world views America, and in the last 2 years, I'm not talking in the last week, there is a steady diminishing in the world's perception of America as a force for positive change and intervention in the world.
Let me pose.
This is why Biden made the resurrection of the democratic like-minded community.
What, the summit?
Not just the summit. The whole spirit of the interim guidance that came out in March 21 was suffused with the notion that we first of all need to reunite the democracies around us.
Let me pose another topic for almost the last part of our conversation. And that is, we are all speaking from certain worldviews, perhaps a certain worldview common to all of us, but definitely worldviews, plural. But now, with the rise of fake news, with social media, are people around the world seeing the planet the same way? Is there a common reality? Or are people and governments which are manipulating it, are they reacting to different views of the same world, Miri?
I absolutely think that nowadays we are more separated than united. It's not just a question of fake news in that terminology. It's that we live within our echo boxes. And to get outside of our echo boxes takes an action that I think that, I'm being an enormous generalization right now, Dafka, the younger generation.
You mean bubbles?
Bubbles, echo boxes, and that there's much less nuance, and that people don't get nuance in the way that I think there was more about, and then I'm suddenly going, Cold War kind of lacked nuance. You were on this side or that side. So as if it's similar, but in this case, I'm very challenged by the way that people view. I'm going to dive into the one thing which is on the little thing on back. I like that. You know, we haven't spoken at all about the pandemic. But just think of the different views. And I'm going, how can people have views about the pandemic? But there are views about the pandemic. And I don't think of them as legit, and we call them fake news. But that's part of the challenge. It's not just on the pandemic, it's on every single subject.
But this particular dimension that you mentioned is really about science, about theology, about conspiracy theories.
About belief, about ideology, and all of the above.
Eran.
Science has been degraded from its position of almost a religious reverence that it held, let's say, in the 20th century, or parts of the 20th century. Everything from the bomb to inoculations that killed pandemics, and people adored and admired scientists. Nowadays, I think it didn't begin with the pandemic. It began with the questioning of global warming as a systemic doubt cast on the wisdom of the scientists when it clashed with the interests of certain powerful groups.
And ideology, not just
And
interests.
then that tied in
That's
with
Al Gore 20 years ago.
struggling against people who basically doubted the validity of the science behind his predictions. And of course, Trump took this. Trump is, I agree, a significant event. It is not a hiccup. What he stood for, what he did to the validity of science, for example, is highly troubling.
Alternative facts. Alon.
What?
Are you confident that people will reach the judgment based on some agreed set of facts?
Okay, on the one hand, we all have complaints about, technology and we all use this and there's connectivity, and that allowed psychopaths and fact deniers and science deniers to come out, but they were always there. They connect with each other now. They are more vocal now. The idea that technology is going to provide the great equalizer and democratize the world had a flip side to it. On the other hand,
in the 20s, you could stand trial in the States for teaching evolution.
Right, exactly.
In the 1920s.
And there were always conspiracy theories that they just didn't have websites about the Earth being flat and Elvis Presley being seen in Miami Beach or right here next to Jerusalem.
Some of our viewers right now are very upset.
Well, I'm sorry.
No, Elvis.
Elvis leads.
Okay. On the other hand, let me just one. I know people tend to
5 seconds.
People tend to be pessimistic. In terms of the evolution of humanity, this is probably the best time ever. The access to readily available. I'm not saying that it's equal. I'm not saying that the.
Are we going to survive?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine for the time being. Thank you, our 4 powers here, Reuven, Ben-Shalom, Alon Pinkas, Eran, Lerman, and Miri, Eisin. And Shalom and Merry Christmas to our viewers around the world. And we will see you in another episode soon.